welcome back to the Deep Dive. So have you ever been watching one of the big franchises, Marvel, Star Wars, Alien, that kind of thing, and you just get this feeling like the characters on screen, the heroes, the experts, they just seem, well, dumber than you are sitting on the couch. It's a bit frustrating.
Yeah, that feeling, that sense that the competence just isn't there anymore. That's exactly what we're digging into today. Our sources, they actually talk about an epidemic of character simplification.
Okay.
Or sometimes they're blunter. They call it an epidemic of dumbness that's supposedly cropping up in these massive IPs.
Wow, okay. Epidemic of dumbness.
Yeah. So our mission today isn't just to, list complaints. We want to really look at the evidence the sources provide, these specific examples of incompetence they cite.
Right.
And then, crucially, dig into the pipeline, the structures, the executive decisions that might actually be causing this, according to the sources.
And this isn't just one or two franchises. You mentioned Marvel, Star Wars, Alien.
Oh, yeah. The critique covers a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Star Trek, DC, Predator, even Tolkien property, like The Rings of Power.
Huh. So what's the main thread? What's the core observation they're making?
It's this idea that what we used to see as normal behavior for professionals or heroes in high-stakes situations, composure, actual competence, restraint, that allegedly been swapped out.
Swapped out for what?
For characters who are, jittery, always talking, kind of emotionally all over the place, emotionally incontinent is a phrase used.
Okay.
And their decisions often come across as impulsive, reactive, and frankly, just strategically not very bright. Frustratingly dumb, source puts it.
Right. From someone who thinks things through to someone who usually badly.
Precisely. It's that shift. And it makes you ask why. Why move away from that measured authority towards jokes and snark and constant emotional displays and decisions that just don't seem smart.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. We need the evidence first, right? The case file.
Exactly. Let's ground this. We need to look at the examples where character choices really seem to break the internal logic or the stakes of the world.
Okay, where do we start? You mentioned Jurassic Park.
Yeah, the Jurassic contract is a great starting. Think back to the original Jurassic Park, Dr. Alan.
Right, Sam Neill. Very composed.
Exact. Composure, shrewd assessment. He's a professional, reacting intelligently or as intelligently as possible to a completely terrifying, unprecedented situation. You believe the danger, partly because he took it seriously professionally.
Okay, I'm with you. So how does that compare to now, according to these sources?
Well, they point to something like Jurassic World Rebirth, and the critique is about how a major disaster kicks off. It's not some complex sabotage or, a subtle system failure.
No. What is it then?
It's because a character apparently lets a Snickers bar wrapper.
A Snickers wrapper? Seriously?
Yep. Get sucked into a high-security vent, causing a massive system failure. The sources argue this just reduces the whole catastrophe to almost like farcical levels of carelessness.
Does sound a bit flimsy for a major plot.
And the critique goes deeper. It's that everyone seems equally prone to these basic errors. Mercenaries, corporate types, scientists, they're all written, the sources claim, with this kind of immediate strategic failure. Quick emotional flips instead of...
So it's not just one clumsy character, it's systemic within the story.
That's the argument. And they also highlight the family who decides to sail a tiny boat in waters they know are full of gigantic, spiky, marauding aquatic dinosaurs.
Okay, that does sound objectively like a bad...
Right. And the source presents this not just as bad judgment, but as proof that the plot needs the characters to make these fundamentally poor decisions just to keep things moving.
Yeah.
The story mechanics demand strategic impairment, it seems.
All right. So scientists, families, what about superheroes? Surely they're still competent. Early Marvel felt...
It did. Tony Stark, you had that brilliant inventor mind, the dangerous wit.
Yeah.
You were smart.
And Steve Rogers, Captain America, very different, but definitely competent, strategic.
Or restrained.
Exactly. Peak performance professionals in their own way. But the argument is that by phase 4, maybe it's the sheer amount of pipeline we'll talk about later, characters get simplified.
How so?
Well, the example given is Thor, particularly in Love and Thunder. He's described in one source as an intellectually diminished, muscle-bound buffoon.
Ouch.
Yeah, his strength is still there, obviously, but it's constantly undermined by choices that are framed as, infantile or just played for slaps. The critique is that this eats away at the character's depth, turns a god into kind of a joke.
Okay, I can see how that might frustrate people. Any other Marvel examples?
Yes, and this one is interesting because it focuses on a character defined by intelligence. Riri Williams, Ironheart.
Right, the tech genius,
Right.
MIT student.
Supposedly a prodigy. But the sources point out actions they call confoundingly tactically inept. Like, she risks everything by getting caught cheating at MIT. For a genius, that's odd. Strategically weird. Yeah, doesn't quite track.
And then, apparently, within minutes of that, she completely abandons her moral compass to join some shady criminal group.
Whoa, okay. That's a sharp turn.
And here's the kicker. This criminal group, their success isn't down to being smart or well-planned. The source claims it's mostly sheer strategic luck, or just the fact that the bad guys they're up against happen to be even less strategically aware.
So the genius character's defining trait, her intellect, her ability to plan, it just evaporates in service of the plot.
That's the core critique. It's hollowed out, leaving only impulsive, high-risk, strategically poor behavior.
Okay, let's switch genres. Sci-fi horror. That feels like a place where competence, or the lack of it, is absolutely crucial. Alien, for example.
Alien is the perfect case study, the original. Ripley, the Nostromo crew. They felt like real working professionals, right? Plumbers in space, almost.
Yeah, truckers in space. Fallible, but professional.
Exactly. And the horror came from watching their professional systems, their composure, break down under unbearable terror. They made mistakes, sure, but they felt like human mistakes under pressure, logical within the context.
So how does that compare to newer Alien entries?
Well, the critique of something like Alien Romulus is that it leans more into like teen horror tropes in space. Characters described as shrill, one-note, and strategically simplified.
Meaning
They ignore really obvious dangers, they emote theatrically, but maybe at the wrong times for survival. And the source claims the effect is, well, you actually start rooting for the xenomorph because the humans are just making such consistently bad calls.
that's not ideal for a horror movie, is it? You want to identify.
You'd think so. And then there's the example labeled the apotheosis of strategic failure, Alien Earth.
Oh boy, what's the description?
It's quite something. Features a man-child scientist acting with baffling strategic ineptitude. Synthetics, someone has a pet alien, and the crew is described as tedious.
Yeah.
One character is apparently preoccupied with his low storm count.
Wait, what? In an Alien story?
That's what the source highlights. Another is supposedly an incompetent first responder. It suggests a complete loss of professional focus and narrative gravity.
Yeah, if your main character trait is worrying about fertility during an alien attack, maybe the priorities are skewed.
It feels like the writing prioritized these bizarre personal quirks, sort of high drama, emotional stuff over basic situational awareness or, professional discipline needed to survive xenomorph.
Okay, wow.
Then-
And Predator. That franchise started strong too. Very tense, tactical.
McTiernan's 1987 film, yeah. Pure visceral dread. Professional soldiers methodically picked off by something unknown, hyper-competent.
And now,
Now, the source points to a recent trailer featuring what it calls a numbnuts predator.
Numbnuts Predator.
Engaging in kooky buddy duo hijinks with a legless android.
Okay, that sounds like a significant tonal shift.
Very much. This modern predator is characterized as young, naive, and strategically diminished. The plot apparently involves him needing to overcome macho posturing and simplistic staunchness, based learning teamwork with a robot sidekick.
So less of a terrifying ultimate hunter and more of a protagonist needing character development.
That seems to be the interpretation. A shift from lethal mystery to buddy comedy.
All right, last category here. Fennis, Tolkien, Star Wars, surely the epic arc.
Well, according to the sources, not always. They look at the rings of power. You have elves who are supposedly thousands of years old. They should have immense wisdom, foresight.
Right, ages of experience.
Yet the critique is they are constantly hoodwinked and manipulated by really simple, almost transparently obvious schemes.
Doesn't sound very wise.
Their actions are described as impulsive, quippy, or strident, not measured or mythic. There's mention of them getting into dumbly passive-aggressive squabbling over minor jobs. It just undermines the sense of ancient gravitas.
In Star Wars, original trilogy characters felt pretty archetypal, spoke simply, but
Yeah, kind of mythic simplicity and often strategic clarity. Compare that, the sources say, to The Acolyte. Characters are described as indecisive and erratic, competent often failing them when needed.
okay, like how?
The critique of the Jedi group in The Acolyte is pretty blunt. They're described as thick as pig shit. That's a direct quote from a source for how they handle a situation involving a coven of lesbian space witches. The point being, their collective decision-making and interpersonal skills fail them.
Thick as pig shit. Okay, that's direct.
Yeah.
Any specific examples of this poor decision-making?
Yeah, a couple are highlighted. One Jedi apparently enters a trance for 10 years as a form of penance. The source calls this highly ineffective, strategically pointless.
10 years in a trance doesn't sound very helpful.
And another plot point relies on one of the main characters, a grown woman, falling dumbly head over heels for the guy who literally just butchered her friends and family.
That feels like a massive strategic and maybe psychological blind.
Exactly. And the sources also mention a dumb hamster rodent creature for good measure. The overall point is that the plot seems to advance because characters are forced, again and again, to make choices that violate their supposed wisdom, their training, their duty, or even just basic common sense for survival.
So across all these genres, the pattern is characters acting below their expected level of intelligence or comp, often to make the plot happen.
Precisely. The actions point to a pattern. Now, let's shift slightly. Let's look not just at what they do, but who they are or how they're presented. This modern archetype seems defined by emotional volatility. The sources use this term emotional incontinence.
Okay, emotional incontinence. That sounds clinical. What exactly do they mean by that in this context?
It's a key phrase. What they mean is this apparent need for characters to constantly and often loudly signal their internal state. Trauma, fear, sadness, vulnerability, it all has to be on the surface performed.
Instead of,
say, subtle acting, quiet stoicism, professional composure, or just internalizing stress and getting on with the job.
Yeah.
If a character's scared now, the argument goes they have to visibly shake or cry or talk nonstop about their feelings.
Okay. Less show, don't tell, and more tell and show loudly and often.
Kind of, yeah.
Right?
And we see this applied in the critique of Doctor Who. Earlier doctors, Tom Baker, Peter Davis, and even later ones like Tennant or Capaldi to some extent, balanced the whimsy with real sharpness, sometimes menace. There was this sense of ancient intellect, wisdom beneath the surface. The dialogue often carried real weight.
Right. You felt there was more going on internally.
But recent seasons, according to these sources, lean heavily into what they call dumb pizzazz, frenetic energy, and constant mollycoddling affirmation.
Mollycoddling affirmation.
Yeah, like constant reassurance and emotional validation. And one source uses the phrase dumb, shrieking, mincing drag to describe the performance style.
Wow. Okay. Strong words.
Very. The point is that the intellectual, often reserved core of the character gets replaced by this high-energy, perpetual emotional signaling. The sources argue this sacrifices the character's wisdom for kind of simple, easily digestible, maybe superficial enthusiasm.
And this erosion of gravitas, it affects the big icons, too, like Superman.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
The DC critique suggests that instead of that classic, clear moral compass, this sort of quiet authority.
The Christopher Reeve archetype.
Exactly. The newer takes allegedly gets sanded down into angst, self-conscious, quirk, impulsivity, becomes less of an ideal, more average. Plain average-minded, doofy, everyday dude, plain dumbness is one rather colorful description.
Okay, so less aspirational, more relatable in his flaws.
That seems to be the idea. And it affects the villains, too. Lex Luthor, the ultimate cold, calculating, evil genius.
Gene Hackman, Kevin, very controlled.
Right. Now, described as emotionally high-strung and two-dimensionally simplified, a character who visibly melts down dumbly, as the source puts it. The fight becomes less about intellect versus intellect and more about who has the bigger emotional outburst.
And Star Trek. You mentioned that earlier. That was always the gold standard fashion.
For decades, yeah.
Yeah.
Think The Wrath of Khan, that melancholy feel, the professional discipline, the nautical vibe, characters acting like mature adults under incredible pressure. That's often held up as the peak.
So what's the critique now?
That peak, the sources argue, has degenerated into the paragon of dumbness.
Oof.
They point to how organizations like Section 31 are portrayed. Characters described as obtuse, supercilious Californians floating about in space. Not exactly Starfleet professionals.
Supercilious Californians in space. Okay.
Yeah.
What about the bridge crew dynamic?
That's a major focus. The claim is that Starfleet officers now regularly cry, argue, and make rash decisions on the bridge.
On the bridge.
Oh,
The command center.
Yeah. Turning, as one source describes it, into a high school cafeteria instead of a place of strict professional decorum.
High school cafeteria. That's quite an image.
And they cite specific examples to back this up. Episodes featuring Muppet, an episode where Klingons apparently start dancing. It's presented as evidence of a total collapse of the original serious tone and commitment to a professional future.
Muppets and dancing Klingons. Okay. So across the board, we see this shift toward visible emotion, sometimes questionable decisions. Why? Why this pattern? Is it deliberate?
This brings us right to the core argument the sources make about the relatability trap.
The relatability trap, okay?
Think about the old archetypes we mentioned. Ripley, Kirk, maybe the original Galadriel from Lord of the Rings. They often had composure, they were maybe a bit taciturn, they had a certain mystique or distance. They were figures you looked up to, maybe aspired to be like.
Right, they weren't necessarily just like us, they were more.
Exactly. The sources argue that the new versions are often intentionally engineered to be more immediately relatable. But the perceived result is that they come across as shallow, strategically flawed or glitchy, and ultimately simplified or dumb.
So making them relatable makes them dumber. How does that work?
Well, relatable in this big franchise context often means giving them very visible, very common flaws, maybe anxieties we recognize, mistakes we might make. But when you swap out that core of competence, that mystique, that composure.
The things that made them feel heroic or capable.
Precisely. When you swap that out for constant emotional accessibility, for needing to show their flaws all the time, they lose their narrative authority. They have to over-emote. They have to make basic strategic errors just to prove they're flawed and relatable like one of us.
And that undermines the whole premise of them being competent professionals or heroes in these high-stakes worlds.
That's the argument. They become defined by their vulnerabilities, their mistakes, rather than their capabilities. It might make them instantly accessible, maybe generate some meme.
But it makes them less compelling heroes, less believable in their roles.
Potentially, yes. Less aspirational, more. Just kind of there, messing up like everyone else, which isn't always what you want from your starship captain or your 1,000-year-old elf.
Okay, so this shift towards relatability and maybe away from competence, it's not accidental then. You mentioned a pipeline. We need to look behind this.
Exactly. To understand why this simplification might be happening so consistently, the sources argue we have to look at how writers are brought in, how scripts are developed. There's a whole structure they map.
So how do writers typically get into these big franchises?
Well, for TV especially, a lot of entry points are through these diversity staffing fellowships. You know, the ones run by Disney, ABC, Warner Brothers, CBS, places like that. Or they get placed by agent.
Okay. And then what? How do they move up?
There's a pretty standard ladder. You submit spec scripts or samples, maybe get hired as a staff writer, then climb up through story editor, co-producer, producer, and so on. For film, junior writers often do punch-ups, basically, adding jokes or tweaking dialogue on existing scripts.
Right. So what's the issue with that pipeline, according to the sources?
The contention is that these entry programs, while aiming for diversity, which is obviously important, often end up selecting writers who might be less experienced in, say, complex, long-form narrative structure.
And more focused on?
More focused on demonstrating a really distinct, immediately noticeable, strong voice or identity in their sample script. In a huge pile of applications, you need to stand out right.
Makes sense. A unique voice gets noticed faster than maybe subtle plotting.
Perhaps. And the argument is that this focus on voiceover craft, specifically craft of long-form plotting and character consistency, carries through. It prioritizes immediate personal expression over maybe deeper structural skills or strategic thinking in the narrative.
Okay, so the entry point might filter for a certain kind of writing. What happens next?
That leads into these things called franchise incubators or writer camp. Studios like Marvel, Disney, Lucasfilm run.
Writer camps? What are those?
Basically, they bring in dozens of writers, often from that fellowship pool, to pitch different takes on characters or storyline for the big IP.
Dozens of writers pitching on the same thing.
Yeah. And the source argues this creates a sort of pool of interchangeable names that the studio can draw from, rather than relying on, say, one showrunner or a single writer with a really deep, consistent vision for the property.
So it becomes more like writing by committee from the start.
That's the implication. It prioritizes breadth of voices over depth of craft. And this leads directly to what the sources call the consensus problem.
The consensus problem. Okay, explain that.
When you have a script being developed, or even just outlined by a large group, or constantly reviewed by multiple executives, the argument is that complex or ambiguous beats tend to die.
Why do they die? Too many opinions.
Partly, but it's also about risk aversion. Imagine a quiet scene. A character shows competence through restraint, maybe doesn't react emotionally, makes a subtle tactical choice.
Okay.
In a big writer's room or an exec review, someone's likely to flag that. Is the motivation clear enough? Will the audience get it? This feels slow. Can we make this punchier for the trailer? Subtlety becomes a risk. It requires patience from the audience.
So the quiet, smart move gets cut because it's not loud and obvious enough for everyone instantly.
That seems to be the mechanism described. The system itself, the committee approach, actively selects against subtlety, ambiguity, or quiet professional restraint. Characters have to signal everything: fear, intelligence, tension through overt act.
And often the easiest overt action is a mistake, a dumb choice.
Exactly. A character making a visible, maybe even catastrophic error is instantly legible. Everyone understands they messed up. A character making a quiet, complex, strategically brilliant move, that might require more setup, more audience trust, patience. It doesn't test as well in screenings, maybe.
So strategic failure becomes the narratively safe choice in this.
It appears that way, according to the sources. It's loud, it's clear, it generates immediate drama, even if it makes the character look less competent.
Interestingly, the sources don't just complain about this. They actually suggest a fit, right? The different way to find writers.
They do. They propose that studios could use anonymous submission process, like blind auditions.
Blind auditions, like orchestras do.
Yeah, or like some big short story competition. You submit the script or the pitch without your name, without your demographic info attached initially.
The idea being?
The idea is to take the author's identity, their voice pitch, out of the equation at first. You judge the submission strictly on the basis of ingenuity and sophistication and clear understanding and devotion for the idea.
So pure meritocracy based on the quality of the idea and the writing craft itself.
That's the logic presented. Shift the focus from how well the writer presents themselves in the room back to how well they can actually execute complex, mature storytelling on the page. Rewarding craft and narrative intelligence first.
But couldn't that, inadvertently filter out unique voices? If you anonymize everything, do you risk just getting stuff that fits a pre-existing, maybe outdated mold of quality? Could it stifle the very originality?
That's a really fair counter and a potential risk of any blind system. The sources might argue back that the current system also stifles originality by demanding conformity to this instant legibility model we're about to get into.
Oh, okay.
While a blind system might initially favor writers who've mastered classic structures, the hope, I suppose, is that it changes the incentive. You're no longer primarily rewarded for the wittiest pitch in the room, but for the most sophisticated plot, the most intelligently written character who acts with believable strategic competence within that specific IP. It's aiming for structural maturity over immediate marketability signals.
Okay, so we have characters making questionable choices, maybe because the writers are incentivized differently by the pipe. But who's setting those incentives? Let's talk about the top level of the executive. This feels like where the why comes from.
Absolutely. This is where the sources trace the ultimate pressure back to. And it boils down to primarily two big fears driving studio decisions today.
Which are?
Fear of audience boredom and fear of losing global market share. Executives, the sources claim, operate under this core assumption that modern audiences need constant emotional handholding.
Emotional handholding.
Yeah, like everything needs to be over-explained, constant jokes to break any tension, immediate comic relief after anything serious happens.
Because they're afraid people will tune out, quiet or complex.
That's the fear. A quiet moment of competence, a scene built on subtle character work or professional procedure that's seen as dangerous. It might be the point where someone checks their phone. So instead, you get constant jokes or characters crying or what the sources call melodrama.
Melodrama, like manufactured drama.
Yeah, excessive emotional crises that maybe don't feel entirely earned just to keep the energy level high. Anything to avoid silence or subtlety. Composure is seen as boring.
So the old style, the composed hero, the taciturn expert, the mythic figure that's just considered too slow, too demanding for today's audience.
According to this executive mindset described in the sources, yes, it requires too much patience, too much investment. The new style may be more jittery, emotionally volatile, making obvious mistakes that's seen as the safer bet to keep eyeballs glued minute by minute.
And this ties into the second fear, the global market.
Directly. This leads to what the sources call the single most important pressure-shaping modern blockbuster writing, the global legibility demand.
Okay, global legibility demand. That sounds important. Break that down for us.
It's huge. Studios depend massively on worldwide box office and global streaming numbers. They cannot afford to alienate huge chunks of the international audience. Therefore, the mandate comes down. Scripts must be instantly legible.
Instantly legible. And the sources have a specific interpretation of what that in practice, right?
They do. They're quite blunt about it. They say instantly legible effectively translates to being dumb, or rather, demanding strategic simplification.
How does needing global appeal lead to simplified character? What's the connection?
Okay, think about it. What gets lost in translation is cultural nuance, historical context, complex motivations rooted in specific ideologies, political subtlety, deep intellectual ambiguity, anything requiring prior knowledge or interpretation.
Right, that stuff might not land the same way in every country.
Exactly. So to be instantly legible everywhere, you strip that stuff away. Everything has to be spelled out. Emotional states have to be big and obvious. Motivations have to be simple. There's this underlying belief, the sources claim, that global audiences won't tolerate distance, subtlety, or austerity.
So a character acting competently based on, say, deep knowledge of Starfleet protocols or some obscure piece of Middle-earth lore, that's risky.
Potentially risky, yes, because understanding why they're doing that requires that specific context, that narrative patience. It might not translate instantly onto a phone screen in a different cultural context. But if a character cries big tears or yells in frustration or makes a really obvious, impulsive, maybe catastrophic mistake like grabbing the glowing artifact they were told not to touch, that action, that emotion, that strategic failure, it's instantly legible everywhere. It requires zero subtext, zero cultural translation. Oops, they messed up, is universal.
Wow. So simplifying the character's choices, even making them act dumber, becomes a tool for maximizing global understanding and reach.
That's the direct line the sources draw. The simplification isn't necessarily the goal, but it's the result of prioritizing immediate universal comprehension above all else.
So, stepping back, the problem isn't necessarily that we suddenly have untalented writers.
No, the sources are generally careful not to say that. They acknowledge there's immense talent out. The issue they identify is that the entire system, from the fellowship through the writers' rooms, right up to the executive mandates, is actively rewarding the wrong creative instincts for complex storytelling.
Rewarding what, specifically?
Rewarding instant readability. Rewarding that kind of quippy, social media-friendly wit that travels fast online. Rewarding simple emotional shorthand over deeper character work.
It sounds like a feedback loop. Marketing needs instant hits. Global markets need easy understanding. Testing favors the obvious. And all of that pushes against complex, intelligent characters.
That's precisely the loop described. The needs of mass market, globalized entertainment funding and distribution seem to be fundamentally clashing with the requirements for intellectual sophistication, for patient strategic plotting, for the kind of layered archetypal characters that defined many of these franchises in the first place.
And the end result is?
The end result, the sources argue, is that these huge franchises, once known for their gravity, their intelligence, their compellingly competent heroes, your Ripleys, your Kirks, your Dr. Grants, they become host organisms for characters who seem strategically simplified or dumber than those who came before them, because the system built to maximize profit inherently selects for that immediate, simple emotionality over complex, lasting intelligence.
Oh, no. Okay, that's a lot to process.
Yeah.
We've gone from some pretty specific, almost comical examples, Snickers wrappers causing system failures, Jedi making baffling choices, Starfleet officers crying on the bridge, all the way up to the systemic issues, the writer pipeline potentially favoring voice over deep craft, the consensus problem in development, and these huge executive mandates driven by global markets demanding instant legibility.
Yeah, it really paints a picture of this deep cultural tension, doesn't it? This pull between wanting maximum global reach, maximum instant relatability,
right,
and the kind of archetypal wisdom, the stoicism, the quiet competence that used to define so many classic aspirational characters.
Yeah.
It feels like we're watching that conflict, the aspirational versus the accessible, play out in real time on the biggest screens possible.
It definitely pushes the conversation beyond just complaining about plot holes, doesn't it? It makes you ask bigger questions about the told.
It does. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on.
Okay.
If these sources are right, if the huge, powerful, incredibly well-funded systems that generate our modern myths, these massive global franchises, if those systems are now structurally selecting against narrative subtlety, against audience patience, against intellectual complexity and strategic competence in their main characters, what does that imply? What does that suggest about the kind of cultural knowledge, the kind of problem solving, the kind of narrative sophistication that we as a global audience are being trained to absorb, to expect, and maybe ultimately to find satisfying?
What kind of thinking are our stories training us? That's a heavy question.
It is, but maybe one worth considering. Next time you watch a supposedly brilliant hero, make a decision that just feels confoundingly simple.